Hi, good morning, and thank you for joining us for the Protecting Community Air Quality and Health Plenary session. I'm Vernon Hughes, your panel moderator today, and I'm with CARB's Office of Community Air Protection. The panel today will provide presentations and a discussion on California's Community Air Protection Program. If you caught it, CARB's Chair, Leanne Randolph, also touched on the program within her keynote address as well. California's Community Air Protection Program is focused on meeting the requirements of AB 617. It's a bill that was passed by California's legislature in 2017, and it requires emission reductions to address cumulative air pollution exposure in the state's disadvantaged communities. Decades of inequities have led to increased air pollution in these communities, and the program gives community-based steering committees that are comprised mostly of community residents a central role in developing plans to reduce emissions and exposure in their communities. As Chair Randolph expressed in her keynote, because transportation sources are a major contributor to air pollution exposure, reducing transportation emissions in these communities is critical to the program's goal of reducing air pollution. And given the transportation health and air quality expertise that many of you hold, we really hope that this plenary is useful to inspire conversation, future collaboration with our program, with each other, and solutions to community-based air quality challenges. In the remaining short slide deck, I'm going to briefly touch on a little more program background, introduce our four panelists who have been actively involved in implementing the program from the start. And then after the presentations from our panelists, we'll have some Q&A time. Important note on there, as you can see on the system, there's both a chat and a Q&A tab. If you could please use the Q&A tab for the questions that you'll have for the panelists in the Q&A session, not the chat, so that we don't commingle chats and Q&A in the same place. It just makes untangling that more difficult. So this slide presents a number of statutory requirements and corresponding program components for the Community Air Protection Program. Today our panel is primarily, as highlighted there, our panel will be primarily focused on a component of the program called Community Emission Reduction Programs. Shorthand acronym is CERP, and we'll be referring to those programs as CERPs. So there are a number of elements to the program as depicted here in the slide. For more information beyond just CERPs, at the top, there's CARB's homepage to our Community Air Protection Program homepage. And then at the bottom is a link to the Community Air Protection Program blueprint that provides the full details on implementing the program, as well as the text of AB 617. It's in one of the appendices. So this slide summarizes the communities that are currently selected into the program. AB 617 requires CARB's governing board to consider selecting communities into the program every calendar year. And recognizing from the start that hundreds of communities are in need, CARB's board decided early on in the program to select initial communities as models from which to glean transferability to other communities across the state. And this approach is intended to multiply the benefits of the program as experience is gained and as these work in the community, each community is conducted. The program, as indicated by the dates there, is entering the third year of community selection, so the opportunity to mine the experience is relatively new. 15 total communities have been selected. 14 of those communities have been selected to develop and implement community emission reduction programs, or CERPs. Our panelist today has been involved in the program since the beginning and eager to share experiences with you. Looking at the map on the right, California has 35 air districts. That's local districts responsible for air pollution control. 6 of the districts have communities selected in them. The Bay Area district at the top left, we have a panelist, Phil Martien from the air district there. South Coast Air Quality Management District, sort of second tier there up from the bottom. We have Joe K. Ghosh from South Coast Air Quality Management District. And then we have Chris Chavez, a community steering committee member for the Wilmington, Carson, West Long Beach community. The program's built on public engagement and centered on community partnerships. Once a community is selected into the program by CARB's governing board, implementation starts with the local air district working with communities to establish a steering committee. And that steering committee is comprised predominantly of community residents. CARB staff also participate in the process along with the community and air district. And again, today's panel, as denoted at the bottom of each of these entities, is made up from staff or representatives from each of those stakeholder groups. This slide presents a depiction of the types of sources that heavily burdened communities are subject to, and these communities vary by geography, population, emission source diversity. Some are in large industrial urban areas surrounded by freeways, industrial sources. Others are in urban or rural areas impacted by agricultural sources, oil and gas extraction, etc. And to ground us in a community member's perspective, at the start of the plenary, our panelist, Chris Chavez, will share his knowledge on the genesis of AB 617, the perspective of residents living in heavily burdened communities, and his experience as a community steering committee member. Chris is the Deputy Policy Director of the Coalition for Clean Air. He's also a community steering committee member for the first year AB 617 community of Wilmington, Carson, West Long Beach. It's located in Southern California within the South Coast Air Quality Management District as depicted on the prior slide map. He joined the Coalition for Clean Air in 2017 and works on state and local advocacy, disadvantaged communities, and electric vehicle deployment. So the high-level process for CERP, Community Emission Reduction Program implementation, it's summarized in the horizontal boxes on the slide, the 6 boxes. Starting with a public process for community nominations. Communities selected for CERP implementation are engaged in an 11-year commitment involving 1 year to develop the program, 5 years to implement it, and then maintain benefits out to 10 years. The arrows at the top of the slide, labeled with years, calendar years in white, it provides a general status of selected community implementation by community selection year. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, 14 communities are now working on CERPs. AB 617 mandates very tight timelines for implementation of community emission reduction programs. Within 1 year after being selected, district board adopted CERP to reduce emissions in the community over a 5-year implementation time. Must be ready for submittal to the CARB board for approval. Air districts are responsible for developing and implementing CERPs, and participation are in partnership with a community steering committee and the community steering committee members. CARB is responsible for mobile source enforcement for each plan, implementing statewide strategies like those presented by Chair Randolph in her keynote, as well as providing oversight and providing support to the program, like developing and sharing data and technical assessments. As illustrated in the blue oval on the bottom right of this slide, detailed building blocks for CERPs are provided in Appendix C of the Community Air Protection Program Blueprint. The bulleted list to the left that the arrow points to there provides some examples of the workload involved over this 1 year CERP development period. starting with establishing community boundaries and a steering committee. Our district panelists, Ghosh and Martien, will be our second and third speakers, and will provide Air District's perspectives in developing and implementing SERPs with community steering committee members like our panelist Chris Chavez introduced in the prior slide. Dr. Ghosh is the Health Effects Officer and Director of Community Air Programs at the South Coast Air Quality Management District. In this role, she oversees the health effects programs and air quality assessment functions and leads the district's AB 617 Community Air Initiatives program. Dr. Martien is the director of the Assessment, Inventory, and Modeling Division at the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. He's played a leading role in the technical assessment of AB 617's West Oakland Community Action Plan. That's the SERP for West Oakland. The technical assessment of the district's 2017 Clean Air Plan and the district's Community Air Risk Evaluation, or CARE program. Closing our panelist presentations will be Hanjiro Ambrose. He'll lay out some challenges with transportation data and implementing the technical elements of SERPs that we'd like you to consider and consider addressing or solving in your work. We really want to collaborate and build partnerships as the program moves forward. Dr. Hanjiro Ambrose is an engineer with the California Air Resources Board and the Office of Community Air Protection. The office was established in 2017 to carry out technical policy and coordination elements of CARB's role in implementing AB 617. So please welcome our panelists. We'll be starting with Chris Chavez, but again, a quick reminder, you may be wanting to enter Q&A questions and for Q&A for the Q&A session. Again, just a reminder to post those using the Q&A tab, not the chat. So with that, again, welcome panelists, and Chris, take it away.
Great, thank you. Let me load up my slides here. I'll give 1 second. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. My name is Chris Chavez. As Vernon mentioned, I am the Deputy Policy Director for Coalition for Clean Air. I'm also a member of the Wilmington, Carson, and West Long Beach AB 617 Community Steering Committee. In addition to that, I've also been able to participate and observe in 5 of the 6 AB 617 communities throughout the South Coast Air District, South Coast Air Basin, I should say, and have been able to get a perspective on how each of those committees run. I do want to mention that my presentation is limited pretty much to the experience of being in the Wilmington, Carson, and West Long Beach community, and really not in order to not speak for those other communities, but I do provide some observations from all of them towards the end. So, again, this presentations on communities' experiences and perspectives of local air quality and health impact issues. So the Wilmington, Carson, and West Long Beach community is based in Southern California, as mentioned. Again, it spans across different neighborhoods across 3 cities, including Wilmington, which is part of the city of Los Angeles, Carson, and Western Long Beach. I myself live in the Western Long Beach portion of that community. There are multiple air pollution sources within or near the community. The ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles are one of the predominant sources in this region, and they are actually one of the major goods movement corridors globally. About 40% of the imports into the United States go through the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, and as a result, you have significant amounts of truck and train traffic running to and from the ports. A lot of those trucks go onto the next item identified, which are major freeways. And we have 5 major freeways through this region, including the Interstate 710, which I live nearby, as well as California Route 91. A significant amount of the truck traffic from the ports goes through those freeways out to the Inland Empire, which is San Bernardino and Riverside, to warehouses. You also have 5 major oil refineries, which actually is the bulk of California's oil refining capacity, is all clustered in this community or nearby. That includes 2 modified hydrofluoric acid refineries. And though modified hydrofluoric acid refineries have relatively less emissions than some traditional refineries, they also contain additional risk as well. If those modified hydrofluoric acid tanks get punctured, it could result in a low-hanging fog that can result in serious injury or death. And in fact, in 2015, there was an explosion at the Torrance refinery, which is just outside of the community, and the tank was nearly compromised in that explosion. You also have tons of pipelines in this area, terminals, and storage tanks associated with oil production and transportation. There are multiple rail yards to accommodate the ports, thousands and thousands of oil wells. Most of them are abandoned, but many are active or idle. And many of these oil wells are actually located nearby or even underneath homes and sensitive receptors, as they've been there either were put in many years ago before modern planning processes. In fact, the city and county of LA is working on, or there's a big pressure to require a setback from oil and gas operations. You also have a ton of small industrial sources in this region, as well as 1 commercial airport, Long Beach's airport. Other pollution control concerns, which are a little bit outside the scope of AB 617, but still significant in the community, is you have multiple nearby Superfund and DTSC, or Department of Toxic Substances Control, cleanup sites, including, you may have heard about the recent DDT dumping site that was gotten a lot of national attention fairly recently, is actually pretty close to this community. You also have the LA River and drainage channels, and most our rivers are entirely concreted in, which results in water quality issues, as well as the general lack of green space and park access. So the community's air quality challenges in this are well known. The American Lung Association consistently rates air quality as being among the worst in the nation in Long Beach and Los Angeles. The 710 being a major goods movement corridor is, again, well known in the community and in the nation as having major air quality impacts in this area. And again, because of the refineries, refinery explosions, fires, and flarings are a common occurrence. Fortunately, those explosions have reduced over the last 30 years or so, but there still is a number of emission issues related to refineries. In fact, this past weekend, I was driving through a neighborhood near a refinery, and there's a strong sulfur odor coming by from one of those refineries, and it's a pretty consistent experience driving in that exact spot. It's like I could almost time it when I should close the window, or I'm going to get a strong sense of sulfur from the refinery. But one of the neighborhoods I do want to highlight is Figueroa Place, which is nestled between a refinery and the Interstate 110, which is another major freeway in the LA area. In addition to that, you have this neighborhood is in close proximity to the ports, which you can see at the bottom of the map, as well as rail operations which serve the ports. This is a photo I took on a tour of the associated with AB 617. In this case, the neighborhood, which again is the Figueroa Place neighborhood, borders the refinery, the Phillips 66 refinery. This is between the freeways and a lot of these industrial sources. What's important to remember is that a lot of these communities were originally redlined in the 1930s and historically, and because of that, they have long suffered from some of these environmental issues. If you look at the Mapping Inequality Project, Wilmington, which is a community that's overwhelmingly Latino, heavily impacted by refineries and industrial sources, even back in that time, was identified as being a minority community, and that tends to give credence to the idea that a lot of these planning decisions weren't intentional. So focusing back on Long Beach, This is an overlook of Long Beach's pollution burden according to CalEnviroscreen. I live on one of the orange blocks on the western side. But as you can see, that burden is not equally shared. And you have a greater impact on that western side than you see on the east. The eastern side is wealthier, is wider and more, and has a lot more park space than what you see on the western side. You do have a little bit of a pollution burden on that eastern side from the 605 freeway, but the bulk of that impact is on the western side of the city. And again, you can see that a lot of that is from diesel emissions. Being a global hub for the goods movement industry, diesel particulate matter is a constant concern. And in the South Coast air basin as a whole, diesel particulate matter is the leading air toxic contaminant in the region. However, in the CERP, the Community Emissions Reduction Plan for the Wilmington, Carson, West Long Beach community, that air toxic cancer risk is higher, I should say, in that community due to its proximity to the ports, due to its proximity to goods movement corridors such as freeways and rail yards. And this gets into that air toxic cancer risk. This is a screenshot of the multiple air toxics exposure study by South Coast AQMD. This is MATES 4. There is a draft MATES 5 that is currently out there or is in the process of getting approved and finalized. And even though that data shows that overall the air basin has had a reduction in air toxic cancer risk, it's still elevated for the Wilmington, Carson, and West Long Beach community. And I know this map might be a little hard to see, but you can what's clear is that air toxic cancer risk is highest in areas near freeways. And there's a really nice, I wouldn't necessarily call it nice, but a very clear indication where you see that risk is at highest around those freeways. It's the highest near the ports, highest near the 710, and highest near the 91. So these pollution issues, they have real consequences for the communities that live within them. In Long Beach, for example, the difference between the 90813 zip code, which is on the west side, in lifespan, is up to 8.5 years compared to the east side of the city, the 90808 area, and as well as some of the other zip codes on that side. That's a massive difference in terms of the lifespan, but also you have to consider the quality of life as well. Again, residents of West and North Long Beach have a higher risk of cancer as well as asthma. Actually, speaking personally, I had asthma as a kid and had to be hospitalized a couple of times because of it. I know my cousin actually had it even worse, and he lived a little bit closer to the freeways than I did. I grew up actually at the intersection, close to the intersection of two freeways, the 405 and the 710 freeway. So certainly, when you were a kid and when you're, back then, you just kind of assume this is something that happened. But when you connect it to air pollution, it makes the picture make a lot more sense. And then lastly, elevated asthma, cardiovascular, and low birth weight risks are consistent throughout the entire Wilmington, Carson, and West Long Beach community. And this just shows a little bit more on that, dives into the data a little bit earlier. The first slide on the left is from the Long Beach Health Department's Health Needs Assessment. And you can see that the greatest impact in terms of life expectancy is actually on the Black and African American community. And it's important to note that even though this isn't necessarily saying that pollution is entirely responsible for this disparity, but what it does suggest is that pollution, along with other inequities such as health access, quality food availability, gainful employment, things like that, all combine and actually reduce the lifespan of these communities, these vulnerable citizens. And I will also note that this life expectancy chart is actually from the pre-COVID era. And I know that during the COVID crisis, that the Latino community was particularly hard hit in Long Beach. And a number of studies have come out suggesting that air pollution, exposure to air pollution, actually increases your risk for severe COVID symptoms. On the right side, you see a breakdown of the socioeconomic or the economic status. And again, you see the zip code with the shortest life expectancy is also the zip code with the least amount of median household income, whereas the zip codes with the highest median household incomes have the longest life expectancies. So digging into the AB 617 process, the community emission reduction plans, or CERPs, and the community air monitoring plans, as mentioned by Vernon, are created through by the air districts through a community steering committee process. There are 6 community steering committees under the South Coast AQMD. I won't need to get into each of those. Each community steering committee is comprised of residents, community organizations, industry, and government stakeholders. And because of that mix, each CSC has a unique personality and relationship amongst its members, as well as with the air districts and CARB. Residents, I will say, that don't have a strong connection to other organizations or stakeholders are not as engaged. You see some of these unaffiliated people, unfortunately, have dropped off in that process. However, those that are connected to other organizations actually tend to stick with the process. There's a difference in how these district or how these community steering committees are facilitated. You have, such as the Wilmington, Carson, and West Long Beach, where one has a professional facilitator selected by the air district. You also have other communities where you have co-leads, local co-leads who go through that process, such as the San Bernardino and Muscoy community. Community members have a strong sense of air quality concerns. I think one of the best parts of this process was identifying those concerns, because community members were not just able to select the very obvious ones, but the ones that were most meaningful to their local issues. And then industry approaches varied industry approaches to CSCs have varied. Some CSCs have seen industry take a more passive role, whereas other CSCs have seen industry take a more aggressive role. So at the end of the day, what do we want through this process? CSCs have a strong preference for actions that will reduce emissions rather than just reducing exposure, such as filtration. With that said, the CERPs do include some filtration in them, but overwhelmingly, the goal is to reduce emissions. They want a certain level of control and ownership over the 617 process. Community steering committees that are locally led tend to have higher rates of satisfaction. Again, I think the highlights include some of the best practices include the process of identifying community concerns. And recently, we just went through a participatory budgeting exercise to determine what the priorities are for incentive programs. CSCs want to see more transparency between its members and industry. Oftentimes, what will happen is that an alternate will be selected for a member, and that alternate will be connected to the oil industry or connected to some sort of regulated industry. And some CSC members have really pushed for more transparency in those connections. We also want to see consistency with the CERP in terms of other governmental decisions. So a bad example is that there was a proposed rail yard to be built in the city of Colton, which is 1 mile from a community steering committee or from an AB 617 community. Conversely, just this past week, I had a conversation with the city of Long Beach, and they are actually going to begin the process of really putting in AB 617 into their community or their climate action and adaptation plan. Again, the steering committees want to see AB 617 directly address community needs. There was a very big discussion on a health needs assessment, and actually local organizations, including Coalition for Clean Air, have received a grant to make that process start. We also don't want a show and tell model where the districts just kind of present what they're doing. They really want to get into some of the nuances, some of the details for these, for AB 617, and again, have that level of control and ownership of the process. And again, an important note, these are my observations. This isn't intended to speak for any community or CSC, but just what I've seen in observing and participating in this process. And with that, that concludes my slides. My contact information is there if you want to reach out. And with that, I will hand it off to Dr. Ghosh.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. That was an excellent segue into my presentation. So let me get that loaded. 1 second here. All right. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. And again, my name is Jo K. Ghosh. I work at the South Coast AQMD, and I'm here to talk about some of the work that we've done with Chris and other members of community steering committees, working with the 6 designated communities here in the South Coast. So first, in case you're not familiar with who we are the local air district. We cover the major portions of these 4 counties in Southern California. We are an extremely large air district, larger than many states. Obviously, a lot of people living in this region and a lot of different pollution sources, including, of course, all the goods movement related sources. Okay. Over the past 3 years of this program, South Coast has had 617 communities designated each year. This is not intended to be a pattern, but we had 3 communities designated in the first year, 2 in the second year, and then 1 community in the third year. So at this point, we are actually simultaneously working with all 6 of these communities in various stages of either developing or implementing the community-specific plans. I know Chris already spoke about the Community Steering Committee and gave an excellent description about the variety of perspectives that are represented on each committee, the differences across various communities in terms of the dynamic, and also even down to the preferences for how the meetings are run. And so, one thing that I would want to mention is, when we started this process, we were all still learning, and we tried a couple different models. One was certainly the district-led model with a professional facilitator. Another one was having a community co-host. Some had co-hosts but no facilitator. Some had a facilitator but no co-hosts. And at this point, the way that it's shaken out is that each community steering committee is really run a bit differently. And for staff, it's we're at this stage, we're pretty used to this level of customization. We sort of have a pretty good feel for the changing the different dynamics of these CSCs. However, one thing that certainly kind of threw a wrench into this whole process was, of course, the need to transition to a virtual meeting platform, such as what we're doing today. And this was a first for the Air District, and I'm sure a first for many people. We took about a month and a half or so to kind of get all the technology set up, make sure that staff were trained, and then basically launched into this whole virtual meeting world. And, we also, we're careful to, make sure that our CSC members, were able to participate. We wanted to make sure that the virtual platform wasn't a hindrance for any participation. And in fact, we were pleasantly surprised that in fact, I think our participation at our meetings actually increased rather than decreased in the virtual platform. I think we can all appreciate that it's easier to get to a meeting when you don't have to drive through traffic. The other piece of this is that we actually surveyed our community steering committees to see what meeting times would work best. And whereas previously we would always hold our meetings in the evenings, usually 6 to 8 p.m., we actually found that many of our steering committees preferred an earlier time slot. And so, again, kind of working and adapting to these changing needs of the communities has really helped us, I believe, reach more into the CSCs. I know Vernon already mentioned that there are really tight timelines for the plan development process, and an approximately 5-year implementation timeline for each plan. Because we've had communities designated in each of these 3 years, you can see that some of these communities are in the implementation phase. And then one community, our most recently designated community of South Los Angeles, we are really just in the launch phase. We actually, we recently formed the community steering committee. The steering committee actually at this last month's meeting finalized their community boundary, and we are going to begin the process of identifying this community's top air quality priorities. In other words, what are the areas that they want to work on in this coming year? We then go into the development process, which again, officially is 1 year, but at this point, we are probably about 3 months in. So we have 9 months left to complete development. And then finally, when the air monitoring plan and emissions reduction plan are finalized, it would need to be adopted by our Air District Governing Board, and then also approved by the Air Resources Board. Okay. So I am often asked, what do these plans look like? And without giving you a full, 3-inch thick document, I'm going to attempt to summarize at a high level kind of what is in these plans. And so, one of the things I do try to emphasize is that, we try to think broadly in terms of the types of strategies that we are willing to write into these plans. And, of course, one piece of it is using, our regulatory authority, right, in terms of either strengthening or writing any new regulations, where that might be helpful, and also, of course, thinking through how we enforce those regulations. Most of these plans include a pretty significant outreach and community education component. Really getting the word out there in terms of some of the programs that we already offer, trying to enhance our outreach and education specifically to these AB 617 communities. This program did come with some associated incentive funds, and it's actually pretty broad at this stage in terms of what types of projects they can fund. Traditionally, it's been really based on the Carl Moyer or Prop 1B programs, which focus on reducing diesel. But CARB has actually recently updated the guidelines for the incentives associated with the AB 617 program, and now more categories of projects are able to be funded. And finally, there's a significant monitoring component. I'll highlight a few activities related to that, as well as exposure reduction programs such as installing air filtration, high efficiency air filtration systems at schools. Okay. So one of our designated communities is the Inland Empire community of San Bernardino and Muscoy. I wanted to highlight this community as a pretty unique community that oftentimes I think when I talk to people across the state and across the nation, people are usually not that familiar with. So with this being an inland community, one of the things that they have seen is a real increase in truck traffic, particularly as it's been associated with the logistics industry. Warehousing has certainly, the warehouse industry has certainly expanded in our inland empires, and that has created, that increased associated truck traffic. In addition to that, this community is also has a major rail yard, BNSF rail yard, that is basically in the middle of the community, next to homes and schools, as well as other industrial areas. And so, this is sort of like a mix of the old and the new, right? You've got this, rail yard that has been there for a very long time, and then you have increasing truck traffic. And of course, these are all major sources of diesel pollution, which is an air toxic. This community also identified some unique air quality concerns, which we are addressing through the plan, including a specific bus yard that is also actually very close to the rail yard, a number of concrete or aggregate batch plants that have some fugitive dust, that can create some fugitive dust issues. And also definitely a lot of concern around the schools in this community, particularly the schools that are close to these specific sources of air pollution. So this community's plan was written with specific actions to address each of these 6 air quality priority areas. Okay. Chris described the community of Wilmington, Carson, and West Long Beach, so I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but what I will do is actually focus on some examples of the actions in the CERP, the Community Emissions Reduction Plan, that addressed these air quality priorities. So you heard that refineries were one of the major air quality concerns. Some of the specific areas where we're working on includes improving the flare notifications that are sent out to subscribers. So basically, anyone can subscribe. It's a publicly available service. And then another aspect of our work is reducing the NOx, SOx, and VOC emissions from refineries. And so we are undertaking a variety of rule development efforts, or in some cases, rule amendment efforts, specifically pertaining to these refinery sources of air pollution. Another air quality priority identified in this community was a concern around oil wells. Particularly the active oil wells that are still producing. And so one of the things that we wrote into the CERP was to conduct air monitoring and associated follow-up inspections to identify and address any leaks that are detected at these facilities. So the figure in the middle of the slide shows the output of the air monitoring. It's actually a mobile air monitoring platform that detects VOCs, including benzene, detects VOCs from whatever source it happens to be. And we designed the routes so that they traverse the areas that are close to oil wells in that community. And when we see that there are elevated levels of VOCs, we follow up with an inspection on that site to see if there are any identified leaks. And in this particular example, you can see kind of in the middle right of that map, you can see there's an area of that darker blue along that street line, and you can see that light blue dot, which is the actual location of the oil well facility in that area. And what we found was it wasn't necessarily leaking from the well, but there are these big storage tanks that are at that facility site, and you can see that the FLIR camera image on the right shows where that leak, very specifically where that leak is coming from. In this instance, this facility did receive what we call a notice of violation or a ticket, and they fixed the leak. And then what we do is we actually circle back with the mobile monitor to verify that the leak indeed has been repaired. So this is actually an extremely powerful tool. We've actually used it multiple times in different areas. The wells are located in different areas through this community, and we're finding it to be an extremely useful tool. I'd also mention that we actually are embarking on a collaborative project with a community organization in this community of Wilmington, Carson, and West Long Beach, where the community members will be actually conducting some survey measurements to try to identify certain areas, and that helps us prioritize where we bring this mobile monitor out to. So this is a really good example of a community and agency collaboration that is extremely beneficial for both the Air District as well as for the community. And then finally, this plan also includes some actions related to reducing emissions from the ports. It includes a program, primarily an enforcement program, reducing leaks from oil tankers. This is an issue that we identified a couple of years ago and have some pretty powerful tools in our toolbox to try to address that. As well as implementing specific incentive projects that help reduce emissions from trucks, ports equipment, and hovercraft. Okay, oops, I'm trying to advance the slide. Here we go. Okay, so Chris also mentioned that we went through a participatory budgeting process for the first time this year. And this really stemmed from a desire from communities kind of throughout this program to have more say in how the AB 617 incentive dollars are spent. And as I mentioned, there has been an evolution in this program where kind of when these incentive dollars first came out in the first year, they were relatively. It was relatively restricted and relatively, I guess, prescriptive, in terms of how that program was implemented. But over the years, CARB has modified the guidelines to allow for different types of projects. And really, at this stage, we are able to actually use those incentive dollars to focus them on the designated communities. Whereas I would also mention that the first year of the incentive funds, when those came out, there were no designated communities. So it came up before any plans were in place. So, so again, the purpose of those incentive dollars has really evolved over time. I tried to summarize kind of our participatory budgeting process, and I know this is 1, 2, 3. Looks very simple, but I would mention this is actually a whole lot of work. This is about a year's worth of work summarized in these 3 boxes here. But the overall view is that first we had to develop some kind of overall strategy. We have many environmental justice communities, not just the 6 that have been designated for this program. We do want to make sure that other environmental justice communities are able to benefit from programs such as these incentive programs, and as well as others. But we needed to figure out, what would be the best way to distribute the funds across these many environmental justice communities, including designated communities and other EJ communities that have not yet been designated for this program. So we had a public process to solicit input about that. And, certainly one of the criticisms that we often hear when it comes to AB 617 is the need not to pit environmental justice communities against one another. And so we can kind of very carefully designed that public engagement process to try to avoid that sentiment. And then within each community, we identified what are the current funding priorities. There are lots of different projects that these incentive dollars can fund. Some communities chose to fund air filtration projects and tree planting projects. Other communities wanted to fund EV truck exchange projects and other emission reduction projects. So it really varied across the several communities. And then finally, we allocated the available funding by category, and then the CSCs actually got to weigh in on the specific dollar amount that would be applied to each category. So how many to the truck projects, how much money to the truck projects, how much money to the hovercraft type projects, and so on. And so we will be moving into the implementation phase and continue to engage with the CSC throughout that process. Okay. As far as successes, challenges, and lessons learned, this has been an incredible opportunity to collaborate with these communities and really kind of dig into the local issues and address those through these plans. One thing that I would mention is that, we are used to working on a regional scale. We have a very large region, and, we know how to implement programs that have, big impact over a large geography. But I think, even though your geography is scaled down, that doesn't mean that the resources needed to address those complex air pollution issues are scaled down proportionally, right? It does take a lot of resources to really implement these plans effectively and to do the community engagement as well. So with that, I'm going to conclude my presentation. And am I handing it back to Vernon? I'm sorry, I can't remember.
Hi, Joke. Yeah, next up will be Phil Martien. Thank you, Joke.
Thanks, Vernon, and thanks, Dr. Ghosh. So for this presentation, we're going to be moving up from Southern California north to the San Francisco Bay Area to discuss the implementation of AB 617 by the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. So the Bay Area Air District is composed of all or parts of the 9 counties that encircle the San Francisco Bay. And so far, there are 2 communities that have been designated as SERP communities in the Bay Area. West Oakland in Western Alameda County was designated in 2018 and actually was the first in the state to complete its SERP. And then just this year, Richmond, North Richmond, San Pablo area in Western Contra Costa County has been designated. But as you can see from this map, and as Dr. Ghosh mentioned, there are, for the South Coast, there are many communities, more than half a dozen in the Bay Area that are pending designation, areas where we're using some of the community funding to increase our outreach and to develop what we're calling pre-SERP packages so that we can start engaging meaningfully in other areas. So just at a high level, I want to give an overview. I wanted to start out with a history that's from the Bay Area's perspective, really key to understanding how we should develop our models for implementing AB 617. The history is one of environmental injustice, especially in low income and communities of color. And I want to give an example that's specific to the Bay Area. And as I'll discuss, because the Bay Area has really focused on this perspective, our model is really one of co-leadership and partnership with communities as we go forward and develop these programs. The benefits, one of the key benefits that we see, as you've heard, is that it helps really to focus both from the technical side, which is where I work often, to focus them on issues and concerns that are meaningful within the communities. And then also, as we develop these SERPs, to make sure that the strategies and actions within the plans are really those that the community is concerned with. So for my presentation, I'm not going to give the broad overview of all the activities that the Bay Area Air District is engaged in with respect to AB 617, but rather I'm going to take a look at a slice of some of the work just to give you some a look behind the scenes of what kinds of technical assessments have gone into the work in one specific community, West Oakland, which has, as I mentioned, completed its SERP. So, but let me start with a bit of history. Prior to the state of California's enactment of AB 617, the Bay Area Air District, through its Community Air Risk Evaluation Program, had identified areas within the region with the greatest health impacts from air pollution. And this was impacts both from criteria air pollutants as well as from toxic air contaminants. These were mostly used internally within the Air District to help us to incentivize our grants and incentive funding, to focus our enforcement efforts, and to direct our community engagement activities. But recently, we have overlaid these maps with so-called redlining maps. And here, this map is looking at 2 of the areas identified with the greatest health impacts in the dark outline there with the redlining maps. And redlining was a rating and mapping program approved by U.S. Congress back in the 30s, as Chris mentioned, but with oversight at all government levels. And the idea was to guide home loan investments. And the goal was good, which was to refinance homes and to help stop the urban foreclosure crisis that had spiked during the Great Depression. But the problem was that the implementation was highly discriminatory. And so if you can see this breakout here, the maps were accompanied with text. And here you can see that the way that the loan assignments were made was based on who lived in the communities. So the maps are called redlining maps because of the color assigned to the hazardous neighborhoods, as they were called. And loan ratings were only favorable in the green and light green areas. And these redlined neighborhoods were low-income communities of color. Again, the call out is showing that the reason for the disinvestment was based on who lived there. Black families, African Americans, and families on relief were explicitly called out. And as you can see, there's just an amazing overlap between these redlined communities, communities of color, and the areas the Air District identified as having the greatest health impact. And so the history of government's disinvestment in these communities has been a huge driver of disadvantage. And so as we form our programs and as we think about what we do in implementing these community emission reduction programs, we want to make sure that the people who are most affected, the communities, the people within those communities have a seat at the table as we're developing these programs. So our model has been very much around co-leadership. We're very much wanting to empower the communities to do more than either the Air District or the communities could do on their own. But also, as was mentioned both by Chris and Dr. Ghosh, is that by having the community at the table, it helps us to focus our technical assessments and actions on the issues that are of concern to the community. Now, I should mention that the first community where we worked in West Oakland, we had already a 10-year working relationship with one community group, the West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project. And it was because, I think, because of this strong partnership that we developed, that we were able to be the first in the state to complete our CERP. In other communities, in Richmond, for example, we've had to really work to develop the trust and the partnership that enabled us to make good progress in West Oakland. So working with under a co-leadership model, we put together the steering committee, and the steering committee provided, as I mentioned, lots of good information about the concerns within the community. So we heard loud and clear from the steering committee that big concern, as you've heard in other areas, was diesel particulate matter. West Oakland is a community bounded by freeways, as you can see, but also there is, to the south there, the Port of Oakland, the 5th largest container port in the US. The pink areas shaded on this map are rail yards, and the yellow areas are container terminals. So working with the community, we developed a very detailed emissions inventory to characterize all of these various emission sources, from the highways and the surface streets to the Port of Oakland, including the marine sources, the rail, as well as the truck-related businesses that are all throughout this community. There are some metal recyclers and a sewage treatment plant, stationary sources that the Air District has direct jurisdiction over. Diesel particulate matter was a big concern, but so was just general fine particulate matter. and other sources of toxic air contaminants. So that all went into our emissions inventory, and that inventory was created in such a way that we could input it into a model to estimate, a dispersion model to estimate the impacts that those sources of pollution were having on the community. So because the mobile sources were such a big concern, we really went to great lengths to collect and to tabulate activity information. We used telematics data that you'll hear more about in the next presentation. And we use that not only to develop a link-by-link inventory, but also to understand what what types of vehicles were most responsible. Understanding, for example, what the contribution of trucks serving the Port of Oakland was very important to the community. So this map is showing the average weekday PM 2.5 emissions from the different sources, the different types of vehicles, and each of the links. So we use this type of very detailed information to feed into an air dispersion model. And in this case, we're looking at air toxic contaminants. Diesel particulate matter in California is listed as a carcinogen. And so we accumulated all of those into this modeling approach to map out where are the highest areas of risk from these sources. But also, because we modeled source by source, we were able to develop a source apportionment using this modeling type of framework. So in working with the community, they had clear ideas about what neighborhoods within West Oakland they really wanted to focus on. And they called these areas, which are outlined in white here, the impact zones. And so for each of these impact zones, we developed not only an understanding of what the levels of risk were, but also what were the sources contributing. One of the findings of this work was there was a strong gradient across West Oakland from the highest levels down in the neighborhood by 3rd Street, which was up to nearly 350 per million from local sources of air pollution, up to the cleaner area up in the Northeast at about 110 per million. Again, this just being from sources within West Oakland, not including sources from around the region. The average community risk was about 200 in a million, and this was based on 2017 year modeling estimates. So with this framework, then the community was able to develop what they called equity-based targets for exposure reduction to include within the SERP. And so the idea was to bring those highest impact zones down to in a near-term target of 2025, down to the community average in 2017 of 200 in a million. And then further out to 2030 to reach the cleanest level in 2017 for all of the neighborhoods within West Oakland. So just to summarize quickly, from the Bay Area's perspective, the AB 17 really is a great framework for helping us to partner with communities. As Dr. Ghosh says, it's a huge amount of work. It's like having multiple regions to consider at once in terms of the level of effort. But it really gets to some of these overburdened communities that have, as we've seen in the Bay Area, been historically redlined. It helps, as I mentioned, empower communities to advocate for greater equity. The challenges that we see, one of the big challenges is that we can only move at the speed of trust in community co-led work. In West Oakland, we had 10 years of experience building trust, but in other areas, it's still very much a work in progress. And then the final thing I'll mention is that in order to do this kind of detailed level work, we need better and more streamlined methods of gathering this community scale activity information and conducting those technical assessments. As you saw, our backlog of communities is long, and you know, we're looking for methods of being more efficient as we go forward. And with that, I think I hand off to our next speaker.
Thanks, Phil. Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Hanjiro Ambrose, and I work at the California Air Resources Board in the Office of Community Air Protection. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share some space here with my the fellow panelists and discuss a little bit more about some of the research needs to support AB 617 work. So first off, I want to build on Vernon's presentation and turn back a little bit to discuss, you know, some of the unique challenges and opportunities that are presented by AB 617. As Dr. Ghosh mentioned, after communities have been selected for the program, AB 617 outlines a very accelerated timeline for developing community monitoring plans and emission reduction programs. During each community's first year in the program, we need to answer a number of key questions and build capacity on all sides. And as Chris mentioned, for stakeholders to learn from community expertise and experiences. It can be a big lift, I think as the other panelists mentioned, for districts to develop outreach, to bring communities together around a technical foundation, to identify strategies, and to define metrics to track progress towards those strategies. And all while trying to learn more about community concerns and to prioritize those community concerns in the development of the community emissions reduction programs. So the aim of AB 617 is to reduce exposure in our most impacted communities. That first year is an opportunity, in my mind, for collaborative innovation to really leverage the stakeholders and the community members' deep understanding of the problems that are impacting their own communities. And because transportation, as Vernon mentioned and Chair Randolph mentioned during the keynote, is such a major contributor, reducing emissions from mobile sources is a critical part of these strategies. Often getting a clearer picture of what's happening on the ground in communities is a key part of this process, because there can be data gaps that we need to address as we refine our focus as an agency, traditionally, you know, from the regional level where we focused historically to this local level. And as Phil, I think, just mentioned, this idea of thinking, you know, across regions as we look towards the community level. So AB 617 presents this opportunity to leverage different types of data to track progress. In addition to local and regional air monitoring data, air monitoring data is obviously an important component of any tracking progress, but strategies can focus directly on changing where and how emissions activity occur, reduce exposure, particularly to sensitive receptors, or address other community concerns. And so I think, you know, we're looking, within AB 617, looking more broadly at what types of data could be used to both support community strategy identification as well as tracking progress towards those strategies. And as I say on this slide, we're looking for your help. Today, part of my goal with this presentation is hopefully to spark some interest in how research that's, research and expertise in the room on this intersection of transportation, health, and community air quality can be leveraged to support the needs of the AB 617 program, and as well to benefit disadvantaged communities. So I want to focus in a little bit on three kind of key gaps that I think I'm hoping today we can spark some interest on and some discussion. As we refine our regional approach down to the community scale, we need to have better information on the mix of vehicles, the fleet, the composition of the fleet that's operating in communities. We also need to understand vehicle activity on local and surface streets. So not just on collectors and arterials and freeways, but also on the local streets that sometimes can have a significant impact on local communities. And we also need to develop standard methodologies for analyzing, comparing, and leveraging emerging data sources. One aspect I want to highlight is the landscape for data sources and data providers. There are a number of sources of mobility data, including remote and terrestrial sensor networks, such as on-road sensors like Caltrans, PEM sensors, as well as vehicle GPS or telematics, as Phil Martin mentioned, using in West Oakland. Mobile device tracking, so location-based services, survey responses, kind of more classic, perhaps, travel demand modeling tools, and as well as financial microtransactions and other types of maybe emerging big data. In addition, there's a number of data providers which are layered over this system of data sources, both incumbent and emerging providers who leverage different data sources as well as potentially proprietary algorithms to provide a more complete picture of mobility patterns, such as trips and tours or vehicle flows. So one key challenge that I think I want to highlight is we're trying to understand if and to what extent these types of modeled outputs, these kind of big data approaches or machine learning model outputs, can address data gaps or inform additional data gathering campaigns. In addition to these gaps, we also need to develop standard methodologies for comparative analysis of these emerging data sources. So at the Air Resources Board, we have formed an internal mobile source activity working group to share and build knowledge in this area. And our first project is aimed at improving our understanding of the landscape of mobile source activity data. In particular, understanding the opportunities for emerging or big data to support AB 617 communities and our larger programs in ensuring that reductions in criteria emissions benefit disadvantaged communities first, to support communities in identifying effective local strategies for addressing their concerns, and supplementing our existing modeling efforts. As part of this pilot program, we are conducting a number of ongoing data evaluation projects with different data providers. We've been comparing estimates of vehicle activity or vehicle miles traveled, apologies for the acronym, in communities across different sources, and coming up with some fairly divergent outcomes. And as we observe these different outputs for vehicle miles traveled or vehicle activity, we're trying to learn more about where these different data sources have strengths and weaknesses. And while some of this divergence is expected, given the different assumptions and model forms, I think we really we're trying to understand, working with partners to understand, how these new data sources can be used to supplement existing modeling. Another aim of some of our data evaluation at CARB has been on looking at enhancing our understanding of medium and heavy duty vehicle activity in communities, which can help inform strategies, help inform targeted incentive programs and enhanced enforcement activities. Medium and heavy duty vehicle activity in communities is a community concern that we hear across the state. And in addition to leveraging emerging data such as this, so just to illustrate here on the left, we see a section of Barrio Logan in the northern part of the San Diego Portside Environmental Justice AB 617 community. And on the right-hand side, the drivers, the key generators of major port traffic in the community, or major heavy-duty vehicle traffic in the community. So in addition to understanding the patterns at a finer resolution, these emerging data sources could be used to supplement and inform other data gathering, such as the deployment of special monitoring like automated license plate readers, which we are developing programs to use to identify top routes and corridors, and then capture higher resolution high resolution data on the vehicle fleet. So as I said, my hope today was really to spark some interest in how research that I know many are engaged in here could support the AB 617 program and AB 617 communities, disadvantaged communities across the state. So this is not an exhaustive list, but rather is just some ideas that I think we wanted to tee up. As Chris mentioned, we hear a lot about trying to understand the drivers of local disparities in health outcomes and identify local strategies that are targeted. And several communities are interested in hearing more about health needs assessments. But in addition to health data, I think there's a real opportunity to provide enhanced data on mobile source activity, on vehicle activity to communities to help inform strategies and track progress. This can include, as I mentioned, better data on the fleet mix, the characteristics of vehicles that are operating in the community, particularly where those vehicles are operating. So the vehicle activity on local streets and surface streets, particularly heavy-duty vehicle activity in clusters, as well as identifying drivers of those vehicle activity, as Dr. Ghosh mentioned. Changing land use patterns and siting of distribution centers are changing some underlying traffic patterns for heavy-duty vehicles. And in addition to these drop-in strategies, which I think there's a lot of interest in, we also need standard methodologies for incorporating this information, these new data, and improving existing outputs from the metropolitan planning organizations and existing travel demand models. So as we at CARB continue to evaluate emerging mobility data, we're looking forward to engaging with the research community, folks in this room, on developing new methods and innovative approaches to reduce community exposure, to better understand what types of sources are impacting community, particularly what types of mobile sources are impacting the community, and to provide the most accurate representation possible of vehicle activity, mobile source activity in the community. And that, I think, I'm hoping, as I said, can spark some interest across the room on folks who are working on aligned research questions. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Hanjiro and panelists. Really appreciate your great presentations. Looking at the Q&A, well, first looking at time, looks like we're about 8 minutes over, but I think we'll have time to address most of the questions here. And just again, looking at the chat, or looking at the Q&A, looks like there's a question from Mary Fox, pardon me. In terms of multimedia challenges, in terms of how exposure or our program may not address community exposures entirely, cumulatively from multimedia types of sources, just looking at air. And have we observed this challenge? And the short answer is yes. There have been community concerns, definitely across multimedia spectrums. But I'm going to kick it over to our panel, maybe touching on Eastern Coachella Valley and Joké. I don't know if you want to touch on that. A lot of discussion of late there, and certainly after Joké responds, Phil, Chris, if you have thoughts on this as well.
Right. So this is definitely a challenge, and we definitely recognize that there are so many facets of environmental concerns in these communities. But one of the things that we do try to emphasize is number one, we are required to address air pollution issues because that is what is required by the statute. However, in the discussion of kind of other environmental concerns, such as increasing green space, right, which, has some nexus to air pollution, but, more of a nexus, I guess, in terms of, the built environment as a whole, rather than air pollution specifically. We are able to engage in those discussions, and where we think we can, put something in the plan, put an action in the plan, we've been willing to do so. But beyond that, I think there is an expectation on agencies that we collaborate with other agencies, and bringing them into the program, to bring in their expertise, to bring in their authority, their enforcement resources where possible, is something that we have tried to do. But I think we do recognize that it's challenging to engage other agencies if they are also resource limited. And because, in general, CARB and the air districts have been the ones who have been receiving the funding to implement AB 617, because we are the two agencies who are responsible we are the two types of agencies that are responsible for implementing AB 617. It is actually really difficult to bring in other agencies explicitly to implement any parts of these plans.
All right, thank you, Joké. I don't know if Phil, looks like you might have a comment or a response to this as well.
Just a quick one that is sort of gets to this concern, which is, as Dr. Ghosh mentioned, it's the air districts and CARB that have been receiving funding and that are really on the hook to implement AB 617. But when we look at the landscape and we hear from communities, what we're seeing is that really it is the land use decisions that are also a key part of the process that we're hearing about what needs to change. And so, air districts and CARB, we don't have land use authority. That lies with cities and counties. And so we are trying, and in some cases successfully, to partner with these agencies, but they're not, specifically called out in the AB 617 legislation. So we recognize that, we need to do more in that dimension.
Yeah, and Phil, maybe adding to that point, that can be a critical part as well as forming a community steering committee, is bringing those agencies that are involved in land use decision making on board to the steering committee, so that they can also hear community concerns as well, right? Okay, let's see. Moving on to another question here. Canuck has a question. It's addressed to Chris, but I think there's a number of us that can maybe respond to this, and it's the comment of CSCs preferring strategies that reduce emissions rather than exposure. And I'm going to let Chris address this, but just really quick, having also heard these kind of comments across steering committees across the state. Really, I think, as the number of panelists have said, each steering committee is really varies on their priorities and concerns, and some really want to focus on exposure reduction elements to get the benefits immediately. So that's these kind of priorities are some of the things that are discussed within the steering committees and where they really want the SERP to focus. But maybe since the question is addressed to Chris, Chris, I'll give you a chance to touch on this as well, and other panelists as well, please.
Absolutely, and just to note again for my comments, those are just limited to my experiences in South Coast. Obviously, there may be issues going on in the Central Valley or Imperial County that are different, especially for like Salton Sea communities or communities near agriculture. So that might be a different experience there. I think really the kind of where I focused in on that, or my comment on that, was looking at things like, for example, in the participatory budgeting exercise that we just went through in determining where those incentive funds went. Overwhelmingly, the focus, from what I could tell, certainly within the Long Beach, Wilmington, Carson steering committee, and I believe some of the preliminary results that I've seen from the other ones, really wanted to put the incentives into vehicle replacements. Joe K may have more information or may have some clarification on that as well. But that's like, for example, that's one example that you could easily point to. I do want to touch upon two things that Philip and Joe K also mentioned, or some of these other actions that do yield benefits to the communities, like green space or land use. Those are also other things that, even though they're not necessarily emission reductions immediately or won't result in immediate reductions, they do, the community steering committees, many of them recognize that it's an important facet. And I believe each, it's certainly for the Wilmington, Carson, West Long Beach one, they have, land use issues and green space were both areas that were mentioned in comment letters and things like that. So I'm not certainly trying to diminish the role of those items. But again, in terms of the actual, like, where money is being spent at, from the limited experience that I've seen, there is seems to be a preference towards putting that funding in actual emission reducing projects.
Right. So if I could just weigh in on that. So I'd say, definitely for Wilmington, Carson, and West Long Beach is definitely a preference for emission reductions. And in fact, even though school air filtration came up as one of the top 3 priorities, that steering committee decided not to put any of this year's funding toward that type of project, right? And instead focus on the emission reduction projects. However, I would mention for our 4 other communities that have SERPs currently, each of them decided to put at least some portion of this year's available funding toward exposure reduction. And so that varies from, about, 20 to 30% exposure reduction projects to all the way up to, 2/3 of the funding for exposure reduction projects as opposed to emission reduction projects. So it does vary from community to community. I do, and I think, part of that is really, looking at what types of emission reduction projects, may be available, may be doable at the current time, right? Whereas exposure reduction projects tend to be, in some ways, a lot more tangible. I think, it's a lot more better understood. Whereas sometimes there is, some uncertainty with regard to some of these emission reduction projects. But I think here in South Coast, we have a really long history of implementing emission reduction projects. And I think, we're working on additional project plans so that we can try to address some of the community's specific priorities and not just regurgitate the same types of emission reduction plans that we've been doing in the past.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Joe K and Chris, for that. There's another question I'll touch on really quick from Tony De Lucia and he asks, are the SERPs able to up the ante and focus on climate change? The program, the Community Air Protection Program, is really focused on reducing PM2.5 toxics, criteria pollutants that are precursors to those pollutants. They are not focused on climate change. However, there are clearly, say with replacing mobile equipment with electric full EVs, there is co-benefits associated with the strategies, but there isn't a focus on climate pollutants directly. And then jumping up, we have about 1 minute left. This is a big question. Again, jumping back to Mary Rose. She asks, very glad to see the built-in long-term implementation maintenance, kind of toward the 11-year time frame. But then asks, what about the linkage to community health? Will asthma, heart disease, et cetera, also be followed? Certainly, the data sets that we utilize, that we're looking at, and our panelists presented some of them. There are, in California, there's a product called Gallon Virus Screen that has some of that data built into it. The primary objective of the program is to reduce emissions. That will yield health benefits. But we are about out of time. I don't know if any other panelists have anything quick to say on that. I do quickly want to say thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience, for your questions. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you. It looks like we're out of time, but if there is time, I'll just quickly add that we are tracking health, but we're not tracking it in a way that ties it directly to the plans. We want to make sure that the health outcomes improve, but it's not a specific target within the plans, if that's helpful.
Right. I'd say same here, and I would encourage folks to look at our multiple air toxics exposure study. So that would be kind of one way to look at air toxics emissions and health impacts.
Okay, very good. So in closing out the session, again, panelists, thank you so much for your presentations. Audience, thank you for your questions. We are very interested in collaboration, in having you contact us to learn more about the program, and we want to learn more about the work that you're doing as well. That can help us improve our program in California. So thank you. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Take care.